Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out today to Gilcrease Museum. My name is Cindy Williams. I'm the Acting Director of Education here at the museum. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Holbrook Lawson. She has been the guest curator for our William R. Leigh exhibition. If you have not had the opportunity to see that, please stop by after the lecture. It's really a beautiful show, and you'll really enjoy it. Holbrook is an independent art advisor and consultant based in Tulsa, providing professional advisory services to a wide range of private, architectural, and corporate clients. She currently serves as the chair of the Tulsa Arts Commission, chair of the Oklahoma Arts Council, past chair of Holbrook Museum. She holds a PhD from the University of North Texas, a master's degree from the University of Texas at Austin, and a bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt University. Please help me welcome Holbrook Lawson.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today. Before I begin, I would like to recognize the person that sort of squired me through this whole process as a guest curator. When you come to the museum, you need to have a keeper follow you everywhere you go, and certainly there are doors that you can't open and ways to get in. But the first person I'd like to recognize is Joe Meeks. Would you please stand? Joe and I had the most marvelous time looking through drawers and drawers filled with exquisite drawings, etchings, and we would have great debates over what we should choose or what would look best and what are the ideas to convey. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I thoroughly enjoyed the discoveries that we made. So thank you. I was asked by Frank Mulhern, this was his grand idea that I come in as a guest curator, and I so appreciate his challenge to me to say, can you do it? And by the way, can you write the first ever charter for Gilcrease? And so all of these items ensued at his request, and I thank you for the opportunity. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Appreciate it, Frank. All right, so I just led a docent tour in the exhibit, so the docents that were there will get a little bit of a review in the first part of this. But this presentation today, I would like to focus on Leigh and then move beyond Leigh to the future, and which artists actually emulate some of Leigh's techniques and abilities. So the title is called Showing the Hand of the Artist, the Sketches of William R. Leigh and Beyond Now. So this is a portrait of William R. Leigh that I actually really love, and it is in the show. And it shows his fanciful side in the sense that he is all decked out in his Southwest gear, this beautiful ceramic pot that he would have picked up on his travels. And then look at the canvas behind him. It is actually an unfinished canvas of his, and it has clouds. And if you were to see this photograph more in person, you might see some grid marks in the back of it, which we will come to discuss. I also wanted to point out that William R. Leigh devoted a major portion of his life to the task of developing the necessary technical skills which enabled him to fully realize a creative, original depiction, expression. He did this on tissue paper, on canvases, and in his sketchbooks. Leigh was one of the most prolific and skilled American painters, best known for his landscapes of the American West and studies of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest. He began his training in the summer of 1880 at the Maryland Art Institute in Baltimore. As a 14-year-old, with poor academic skills, he traveled to Baltimore, and then he far exceeded all the classes that they had there. He had grown up on a farm that had been devastated by the Civil War, and they no longer had the affluence to educate him properly. So he was sent there because of his amazing talent as an artist. After 2 years of studying there, the classwork, he had far exceeded the classes that they offered. So it was recommended that he go to Europe to study further. Well, there ensued a really difficult choice for the family as they didn't have the money to provide an education. And as I mentioned in the docent tour, William R. Leigh harbored an intense desire to study in Paris. If we think for a moment what his experiences would be like as opposed to where he went, which was the Royal Academy of Art in Munich, which is classically based, focuses on the function and the technical aspects of drawing. His work would have been entirely different if he had gone to Paris to study. The reason why he went to Munich is that it cost $300 and Paris cost $600. So his family opted for him to travel to Munich. It took him, at the age of 16, several weeks by ship to arrive in Germany. When he arrived there, remember I mentioned he had poor academic skills because he had not the formal education of his 4 older siblings. So when he arrived there, he did not know the language, the German language, and he had poor academic skills. Plus, he was not already admitted into the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Instead, he had to prove himself by making a death mask. So he created a death mask, and then he was granted the opportunity to study at the Academy. He spent 12 years at the Royal Art Institute in Munich studying, and as I mentioned earlier, 10 years of those were focused solely on his ability to draw. During those years, he studied classes like live model drawing, drafting, nature class, composition, and in the last 2 years, he actually painted. And this was at the request of his family, who said, we're running out of money, you need to get to the painting part. So he crammed 2 years worth of painting, and you could see the results were well worth all of his diligence ahead of time. When he was in Munich, he was somewhat of a loner. He spent most of his time on the hillsides, countrysides, capturing moments, making sketches in his notebooks. He was never without one. And then he worked long, late hours, finishing drawings, participating in class. But he did improve greatly academically during those times. He would write these long, extensive letters home to his family and have them critique them and send them back and circle the grammatical errors or the spelling mistakes so that he could continue to improve. He fell in love with the opera, he loved Faust, and he began to have a great appreciation for the classical artists like Rembrandt. At the end of his death, at the time of his death, he had amassed such a collection of literature that the number of volumes exceeded 9,000. So let's look at this stunning painting in the Gilcrease collection. A couple things that I want to note when you first look at this. The use of color for William R. Leigh. It's stunning. You can see the purple hues, you see the touches of green, you see the wispy clouds going across there, the sky. It's a beautiful study of color, which is why I actually, part of being a curator, you get to choose the wall color in your exhibition. And I know from my formative years of growing up that when I would come home from school and see my mom on a ladder painting the entryway a new color, she had been to one of the museums and said, I love that color, and go home and it would be in our house. The actual color that I chose is a Benjamin Moore, it's called Cinnamon Slate, and it has this reflection of the purple hues and the like, which I thought represented the Southwest, and these paintings really were beautiful. The next element I want you to look at is the light. You could probably guess by looking at this painting what time of day it is. I suspect it's morning and possibly not quite noon, or maybe it's 1 o'clock. It depends on the direction that you are. But you can see where in the foreground there are rocks that are highlighted. Then you see that the water is almost in shadow on the right. And in the back you can see that the clouds are illuminating part of the butte or mesa in the background. So he had beautiful attention to detail. The intensity of this work is very powerful. Most of Leigh's paintings, you get the full effect of the drama, and he conveyed that quite beautifully in his works. So there's an intensity and energy with this painting. And then let's look at the form. When you think of form, you think of foreground, middle ground, and background. So in this case, the foreground are these rock structures. You can see little bits of grass on them low, and they're highlighted by the sunlight. And then in the middle ground is actually the river moving through the canyon. And in the background is the rock structures behind the images, giving you proportion, depth, and perspective. All important elements of the work. So this is actually a representation of one of the works in the show. And this is of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. It's painted by many of the great artists. As a matter of fact, William R. Leigh traveled with Thomas Moran, who also did a like painting. And this is a little bit smaller size. And this one next to it is actually a sketch of the very same image that he's working on. But in this case, as you all docents have been through, the painting on the left is a smaller rendering, and then the sketch on the right is probably 60 by 40 inches tall. And so he used charcoal to put on the canvas in order to start to begin to lay in the intensity, the light, and where he would apply color at a later date. Gilcrease is just blessed with these canvases that Joe and I would look at and say, oh, that's so beautiful, and he hasn't even touched it with paint yet. And so that's why I wanted to put some of these works in the show, because his process, his ability to sketch something so meticulous and accurate and then convey it in oil is pretty impressive. So in this case, he's actually going to make the canvas even larger and bigger, which you will see in the show or have seen. Also, there's a photograph in his collection. We're not 100% certain who took the photograph, but it is part of his collection, so he may have used this when he was in his studio in New York just to keep the images fresh in his mind as to what he was remembering and painting when he was so far from it, and not relying on completely a small sketch. So I would say that behind every great painting of William R. Leigh, there's an extraordinary sketch. As I mentioned, he did a lot of hiking and traveling and moving about, and he always kept with him a satchel that held his sketchbooks, his pencils. Sometimes it was plein air painting, studies on small kind of canvas type boards that he would go out there and make these quick, accurate studies of that would later translate into a larger painting. I particularly like this, one of these exquisite drawings that Joe and I discovered in the files. It is of a chance rainstorm. And so imagine if you've ever been in the mountains and a thunderstorm pops up, it is really perilous and dangerous, and especially if there's lightning. So here he is wanting to capture this moment where the rain is coming down. There would have probably been lightning, the wonderful cumulus or billowing type clouds, and that would have been sketched in his notepad. Also, Gilcrease has an extraordinary collection of his. He did clouds. I think that could be a whole exhibition on itself, is the number of cloud paintings that are in the collection. And then below is another one where he is capturing a moment that he has seen a beautiful view and wants to capture that vista, and that later might translate into a larger painting. When he hiked out to these remote locations, he endured great physical ability to endurance to hike into those locations, and he invented this little pop-up stool that he might use to rest and create his renderings. But he had to battle the elements. He had to battle weather conditions, beating sun, also pests. There's several notations in the letters here at Gilcrease that say that there were swarms of insects and he had to try to pick them off the canvases or battle them in order to create his image that he wanted. And these are small in size. They're probably 4 by 6, Joe, would you say? About 4 by 6. They're small. All right, so let's look at these next two images. As I mentioned in the docent tour, that William R. Leigh, at the age of 40, traveled to the Southwest for the very first time. And when he got off the train and saw Walpi, he knew this was his place. This was the moment where he would prove himself to the rest of the world, his incredible ability. And before that point, he had been an illustrator and a writer and had kind of dabbled in things, but not quite successfully. Never enough to quite pay all the bills, shall we say. So when he came to Walpi and saw this, he knew it would be part of his life's work. So the image on the bottom part is actually a finished canvas in the show. The image above it is actually an unfinished canvas in the show, and it is much larger than the finished one. And some of the things to note, again, he's working on the middle ground, the foreground, and the background. The middle ground, of course, is the geometric shapes and structures of Walpi. He became, as I would call it, an eyewitness student, acolyte of the cultures of the Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni tribes and cultures that were somewhat reclusive. And he could probably identify with that. He was reclusive by nature and preferred to work alone and to be out in these remote locations. So he works very hard on getting the geometric structure of that to emphasize the greatness and the perilous sides of this. This Hopi village is on this precipice that is all around it. You could easily topple over. And many years ago, I traveled with my grandmother to this Hopi village, and I have to say my heart pounded as you walk out onto that, because it's like walking on a diving board. And either side felt like you could easily roll off of it or jump off of it. But anyway, it's quite dramatic, and he was in the process when the upper sketch on canvas was created and making a larger version of this. But it is almost exact. You see the same figure. The stripe in the middle may be a little bit of varnish. He might have put the varnish on that to keep the charcoal from smearing or smudging. All right, so let's look at this work. The work on the left, this is called Zuni Bell. The work on the left is an exquisite rendering about this drawing, about this big, in one of his sketchbooks. It is beautifully executed. You see this grid that he has placed behind it, and that's going to play an important part in the process for William R. Leigh. A couple things to note. The one on the right is actually a very large canvas, probably 60 by 40. So he has begun to translate this small image to a large canvas. And for those of you that are not docents, what do you see as differences between the small sketch and the large work? Because the docents already know the answer. Correct. In the small sketch, he has these sort of moccasin type boots in the sketch. Well, they're also in the show. They're part of the Leigh collection. So he would become so fascinated with getting something right that he would actually bring back to his studio in New York the boots or the earthenware or the basketry or a ceramic pot to make sure that he was absolutely accurate in translating it onto a canvas. This is a beautiful, the painting sketch on the right, the large canvas, is really beautiful. She's unfinished, at least one would think she's unfinished, but she does have a layer of varnish on her. And as I mentioned to the docents, the curator and I can see that there was a price tag on the back. So he was probably thinking, maybe I am finished with this at my age. He created it. And here is the next page in the sketchbook where he is trying to figure out and work out the details of whether she's going to have her shoes on or shoes off. And what I very much like about this, and looking at the notebooks with Joe, is that it's like you're reading his mind. You're figuring out his visible thoughts. Should I have her wear the moccasins or should she be barefoot? And he is working out the details in his mind. And it's kind of a window into what he was thinking, which is pretty impressive. Okay, in the exhibitor cell, and when you go in there, you have the opportunity to learn more about the grid system. So we have some examples in there where this is the grid process. You would probably take your little sketch and you would put it next to your large canvas, and then you would maybe alphabetize one side of it, number the other, and then you could correspond that quadrant with exactly what was on your small rendering so that you could get the proportion, the dimensions, the perspective as accurate as your initial rendering. So it's my hope you guys will try that. Betsy, I'm counting on you. So let's see. The next thing I would like to do is take the elements from William R. Leigh and his ability to create these grids and then translate them, move them forward to who uses them currently as modern artists. So the concept of grids is a technical tool that's really important in the art world in terms of getting perspective, dimension, proportions correct. So who uses that today? So as we look beyond William R. Leigh, who does that on the horizon? So what began as a preliminary tool for the greats like Remington and Leigh turned into finished products by Agnes Martin and Sol LeWitt. As Rosalind Krauss in her 1979 essay called Grids said, in the early part of the century they began to appear first in France and then in Russia and Holland, a structure that remained emblematic of the modernist ambition within the visual arts ever since. Surfacing in pre-war Cubist paintings and subsequently becoming ever more stringent and manifest, the grid announces, among other things, modern art's will to silence, its hostility to literature, to narrative, and to discourse. I find this so fascinating for modern art to think that the grid will actually silence that, at the same time that William R. Leigh is using the grid to render a perfectly representational image. And at the same time that he was living, he was writing the most controversial anti-government, anti-capitalism, anti-religion type essays and literature, and his trying to figure out mankind. So it's kind of ironic that you have the opposite sort of transpiring. So the first artist I want to look at is Agnes Martin. Agnes Martin initially was a landscape painter. Martin was, like Leigh, greatly inspired by the nature of the West and the Southwest. Also like Leigh, Agnes Martin was seen as a recluse. She firmly believed that the best things in life happened to you when you were alone, to quote her. This is a first watercolor of hers. Here's an example of one of Agnes Martin's earliest works, and this was created in 1947 when she first moved to New Mexico. As she progressed in her style, she became very critical of her early work and actually destroyed many of her early works as she moved towards the abstract expressionism she is best known for. Here's an example of an Agnes Martin as she moved to abstract expressionism. In the late 1950s, Martin made a final departure from representational painting when she began constructing grids from lines that formed organizational sequences from a rational system. Though seemingly mathematical, the grids let her express the meditative sense of peace found in nature and in solitude, and the beauty and simplicity she found in the landscape of New Mexico. Now, I love this next quote. So she says, one time I was coming out of the mountains, and having painted the mountains, I came out onto this plain and I thought, oh, what a relief. This was just outside of Tulsa. I thought, this is for me. The expressiveness, the expansiveness of it, I sort of surrendered. This plain, it was just like a straight line. It was a horizontal line, and I thought there wasn't a line that affected me like a horizontal line, and then I found the more I drew, the happier I got. First, I thought it was like the sea, and then I thought it was like singing. Well, I just went to town on this horizontal line. So here's another work of Agnes Martin. For Martin, the grids were symbolic of the fundamental tool of making art, making pencil marks on the surface. Martin did use a ruler to create her grid drawings and graphite canvases, but there is a certain softness to her work. It is not precise. There is evidence of human touch and the irregularity of the marks. She did not want to claim an exactitude or mathematical structure with her work. She says, why even musical compositions which are formally structured are not about structure. Because the musical composer listens all the time, he doesn't think about structure. So you mustn't say that my work is mathematical or about structure. So she railed against the thought of that. The next artist is Chuck Close. So now you think to yourself, what does Chuck Close have to do with William R. Leigh? And we go back to the grid system. The photograph on the left, you can see the grid very clearly. Chuck Close's work shows the meditative process of beginning with a photograph and using the grid structure to create a piece from it. He uses the same photograph over and over, most often his self-portrait, by the way, to create multiple works of art on different materials and different techniques, all stemming from the grid, which is integral to his process. As you can see, the work on the left is a photograph with the grid over it. What you probably don't realize is the work on the right is actually a tapestry. So he would have made the tapestry from the grid process. Mom, when we were in New York, we saw one of his tapestries hanging in that hotel lobby, and that would have been with the same technique. Here's another example of Chuck Close's work. Chuck Close once has described his photography as a well to which you can return again and again, and each time get a bucket full of different stuff from it. And that is exactly what Chuck Close does over and over again. He takes a photograph and then he changes the medium up. He changes how he's going to execute that. And for him, every time he switches mediums, it takes on a whole new dimension for him. He sees things in the photograph that he never saw before, or it emphasizes, because the material is different, something else about the portrait. So in this one, the work on the left is the woven tapestry, and the work on the right is a watercolor print in the grid system. So the last one that I want to show you by Chuck Close, oh, there's that quote. It kept going back to the grid in the photograph and then changing up the medium as he translates it. So we saw Leigh using the grid to translate it onto a larger canvas. So now Chuck Close is changing up the medium by which he creates his art. So the last is a Chuck Close as well of his work. And this is based on the grid system again. And he has some great physical, yet terrible, I think, viral infection. And he can no longer stand on his own. And so he has this scroll that comes down, and he's in his wheelchair. And he actually paints these squares in, the grid in. And it's almost as if he's painting the pixelation. So if you were to kind of squint your eyes and look at it, it's a clearer self-portrait of Chuck Close. But he has done this through these little squares are filled in with circles, almost like it's pixelated. These are large, too, canvases. Yes?
Was he on 60 Minutes as a person who couldn't recognize faces?
Right.
This past Sunday?
I didn't see that 60 Minutes.
I think it
Could be.
reminds me of him, and so he doesn't recognize that as a portrait of himself. So I'm pretty sure that, so that adds like another layer onto that,
Right.
that the picture means nothing to him.
Right.
That's why he could interpret this.
So he's a pretty extraordinary artist in his ability to translate works from one medium to the next. The next artist I want us to look at is Sola Witt. Oh, I wanted you to focus. See how on this, sort of teardrops or little circles in, and that's how he actually made the...
Is it oil?
It's oil on canvas. Okay, the next artist is Sola Witt. And Sola Witt first used, most of his career was dealt with the grid. He used the grid from 1960s until his death in 2007, and his very first grid drawing was in 1964. He was inspired by classical music, specifically Bach, and I think in this case there really is a correlation between the mathematics and his grids and Bach. That's a strong correlation there from the way the mind works. So he became incredibly fascinated with the grid system. So like Bach, Lewitt found a richness, a systematic formal logic, and made complex structures out of simple elements. His early wall drawings used what he called simple lines, going either vertically, horizontally, diagonally, left or right, and superimposed lines, which meant that all 4 simple lines were layered together in the darker tones. So he moved on from one-dimensional. Lewitt's gridded and wall drawings transformed into the 3rd dimension when he was influenced by architecture, and he was doing an internship basically at an architectural firm. He became enamored with the structure of a grid. So he called these 3D work structures. So that's the grid concept we still see. And the last artist that I want to focus on brings us back to Tulsa. This is Sarah Morris, and Sarah Morris is a New York City artist, and her grids show the urban landscape and architectural inspiration of cities. She has, as an artist, a living artist, she has a complete obsession and fascination with Edward Durrell Stone. And he was a famous architect born in 1902, all through the 40s and 50s, created some extraordinary buildings. And one of them is actually here in Tulsa. And it is the Cox Business Center. He was the architect for the Cox Business Center, what we call now the Cox Business Center. And he created these sort of tiles on the exterior of the building that are flat on one side, and then they're sort of pyramid shape. So don't think of the pyramid this way, but think of it protruding out of the wall. Well, Sarah Morris has an obsession with his work and loves his work, and she uses the grid. This is actually called the Hancock Tower, I believe. And so you see how she uses the grid to create a city urban scape with buildings going up in it. Well, this comes back to Tulsa. I'm going to show you another one of her works, because this one's actually closer. You can see how she's taken the grid, split it, divided it. The grid is all around us. We drive through the streets of Tulsa on a grid. We type on a grid. We schedule our lives based on a grid. Well, she did for the city of Tulsa, we as city art commissioners created a work of art that is at the Cox Business Center in the courtyard. If you park in the parking garage and go through that courtyard, her work is there stunningly in this courtyard based on the Edward Durrell Stone architectural rendering and building of the Cox Business Center. So our modern lives are organized under this system, so it makes sense that this rich structure has been so elemental in art, which is a reflection of life. In Krauss's essay that I mentioned before, she went on to state, logically speaking, the grid extends in all direction to infinity. So it's my hope today that you remember the fundamental aspects of William R. Leigh and the importance of his technical, beautifully executed sketches and renderings, and then his use of the grid to move it forward to a larger, proportionally accurate, detailed canvas. And so then the concept of the grid has now permeated many modern artists' lives, and then also comes back to Tulsa for us to benefit from Sarah Morris's work. Do you have any questions for me? Or? Oh, you're welcome.
Holbrook, this is certainly a subjective kind of question, but based on your work here for the Leigh exhibit, research you and Joe were able to do, where would you rank the Gilcrease Leigh collection based on what you know?
Hands down, absolutely, without a doubt, comprehensive.
And a follow-up, and if we had vision pass and display this great collection.
Right. I do believe that there is enough material that some truly, genuinely scholarly research can be completed and done. There's a lot more to Leigh than what I presented. Joe and I had the worst time trying to narrow it down so that we weren't hanging 400 paintings in the actual exhibition hall. So there's a lot of room there. It could also be an extraordinary traveling collection for Gilcrease to send out there in the world. No recent information has been written about Leigh in the last maybe 40 years. More. Terry?
How did it land here at Gilcrease? Was it Thomas Gilcrease's
Right.
collection?
Would you guys Yes, Thomas Gilcrease purchased it from his widow in the 1950s, and so it all came here. The whole studio came at that time. Joe, do you agree that this is just the nascent idea for a Leigh show, that somebody could take this and run with it?
I wish there were a way to show all of the drawings in the sketchbooks. They're so fragile, it'd be difficult to do, except like making facsimiles. But
Right.
they really show his skill as a draftsman.
Yeah, they're exquisite. And then you can see him still working it through. There's a image. Rachel, do you think you could pull up those two images? I also want to thank Rachel Matthews for helping me with the PowerPoint. Come here one second. Do you have on your laptop the images of the chief or the rogue ones at all? Okay. You can see him working it through where he's looking at details and trying to figure them out.
Holbrook, while she's bringing that up, while you're here today, go into the Focus on Favorites gallery, the last gallery, the one closest to Hancock Hall, and look at, there's actually 3 Leigh in there, but look at A Close Call. That's my homage to Revenant. If you know what I'm talking about. Down in art storage, there are several oil on canvas studies of the bear, of the downfall in the forest. He's always working through the details. The precision is amazing, but it didn't just happen.
Well, in that particular, it's quite documented in the letters and the archives where that's right. It's documented, that painting and that rendering and how it came about in the letters and archives. And he actually kind of had the guys, hold it, I know you're fighting the bear, but hold on. And then I try to get a sketch in so they can get it accurate. And they're trying to stave off this bear while he's making a rendering of it. So here's another example where he is looking at movement. You can tell he excelled in his anatomy classes because the muscles, the structure is exceptional. You have those? Yes. Okay, this is another one that Joe and I just loved, because here is a gentleman with his robe on, and you see his hand, and we wonder, is he going to place something in his hand? And then you can see his grid. He's working on that. And then the next photo has just his, the robe, has just his robe. There it is down below. Just the robe without the man, where he's trying to get the folds and the drapes. So here's, once again, sort of this visible, thoughts that you get to see him working through. Superior ability. Okay, anything else? I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.